Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruth Agbeloso. I am a financial empowerment coach, and the name of my company is Women's Financial Empowerment Group. So glad to be here.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for being here. I think I got everyone who's online. What about the folks who are there at the chamber?
Yes, welcome. I'll just start off and then we'll just go around the room. I'm Bob Chapstow. I'm the membership director here at the Columbus Area Chamber.
I'm Melissa Hennessy with the Chamber. I'm the project leader. Nice to see everybody.
Hi, I'm Sky Nicholson. I am with Soul's Truth Coaching. I'm a women's empowerment coach and sobriety alcohol coach.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Bierman with Natural Choices for Healthful Living, your whole food market located here in Columbus.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here. And I'm Jeremy, as you already know. So we're going to dive right into this. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into the presentation. We're just going to read some of my emails mainly. Hold on a sec. Here we go. Okay. Can everybody see the screen okay? All right. So at the end, of course, we'll have time for questions. But I welcome questions as we're going, and you can pop them in the chat, or you can simply unmute yourself and ask a question. Chances are, if you're wondering about something, most other folks are as well. So just to break up me talking the entire time, really, if you have a question, just chime right in and we can talk about it. So this presentation is about how to start a podcast to grow your business. Specifically, that's what we're going to be focusing on, podcasting as a business communication tool. Of course, people create podcasts for all kinds of reasons, for entertainment, just for fun, but we're focusing here specifically on what does podcasting have to do with marketing, with actually growing your business. So here is a brief overview of the stuff that we're going to cover. And this also doubles as a checklist that I used with our clients. This is everything that has to happen in order to launch a podcast. So, So just quickly, number one, you start with the strategy and planning, and that's where we're going to start. Building out a content calendar, actually doing recording, choosing an audio hosting platform. I'll explain what that is when we get to it. Submitting the podcast feed to directories so people can find it. We'll talk about that in more detail. Building a podcast webpage, and finally, developing a marketing and audience growth plan. So we'll be spending some time on each of these elements. And again, if you have questions as we're going through, please let me know.
I have one right off the bat, Jeremy. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
All right. Before we all scribble down copious notes, are you going to be sharing these slides with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, if you get them to us, I can get them out to the participants.
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so the first place to start, before you get anywhere near a microphone and start recording, you have to start with the strategy and planning. And the very first question that you should always ask is, well, why would we do a podcast? What would make this a good fit? And I think there are a few obvious reasons that might come to mind. One is that, as you may have heard or kind of sensed, podcasting has become a pretty big deal over the past 7 or 8 years. Podcasting's been around for a long time, more than 20 years, but for, I'd say, the first 10 years at least, it was more of kind of a niche thing, kind of like what blogs used to be way back in the day. If you had a blog, that was kind of your own personal thing, but now every business has a blog, right? As you can see here, podcast audience, the audience for podcasting is just growing by double-digit % year after year after year. Something like 57% of Americans at this point have listened to at least one podcast. North of 30% of Americans listen monthly. More than 80% of podcast listeners spend about 7 hours a week listening to multiple podcasts. And that includes, for all of you folks who run a business or work at a business, that includes a lot of your customers and potential customers. Podcasting is also convenient. it gives you a break from staring at a screen, which I think we've all had more than enough of, especially over the past couple of years. I listen to podcasts pretty much while I'm doing anything else, making breakfast, walking my dog in the car. And I'm sure that if you listen to podcasts, you often do the same thing. Podcasts are by their nature conversational. And here's especially where I see a lot of value in podcasting, especially as a business tool. Podcasting is really built for having conversations with other people. And we'll be talking more about that as we go on. The next step in, once you've determined that, okay, we see some value in podcasting, it's worth thinking a bit more seriously about what it would look like if we actually did a podcast, if you did a podcast at your business. The first step is to set goals. And there, I think, are a number of goals that immediately come to mind. One might be brand awareness. It's just another way of getting your name out there in audio format, although podcasts can also be video, but we can talk about a bit more about that later. Thought leadership kind of goes along with brand awareness, a way to demonstrate your expertise, a way to enhance your digital marketing. Producing an audio podcast, even a 15-minute interview, you can repurpose that into all sorts of other digital content, blog posts, articles, website content, video, and so on. And for any of you who are engaged in digital marketing, you know that part of the calculus there is volume. The more you publish, the more frequently you publish relevant information, the higher you're going to rank in Google search, and the more you're going to get from your SEO strategy. And podcasting can play an important role there. And last, but certainly not least, and here, in fact, is where I see the most value. All of those other things are very valuable and certainly need to be part of your strategy. But the one that's often overlooked is podcasting as a lead generation tool. And we'll talk more explicitly about exactly how that works and what our strategy is for doing that. But it's a way to actually help grow your business, to drive revenue. And in a little bit, we'll get into exactly what that looks like. Now, the main part of that is that the guests that you have on your podcast are the same as your prospects, the people that you're marketing to. This is especially relevant if you're in the B2B world, if you're marketing to other businesses, but even if you're not, if you're B2C, you still have prospects, you still have potential customers out there. And they need to get to know you, you need to get to know them in order to grow your business. And so mapping your customers and potential customers onto your planning for the podcast, specifically, who could you have on this podcast, is a key part of this. Now, once you've set your goals and you're ready to actually start building out the podcast in the most basic ways, what are we going to call the podcast? How often should we publish? What should the episodes be about? It all starts with thinking about your audience. And that's really no different from planning any kind of channel, whether it's producing videos or blog posts or white papers. If you want anyone to actually pay attention to what you're doing, then you have to align the content with the needs of your audience. And I think it really comes down to two really basic questions that, again, anyone in business, I'm sure you're constantly asking yourself these questions. Who specifically is your audience? Who are you selling to and marketing to? The more you know about that, the better you're going to do, generally, whether that's talking about podcasting or any other kind of marketing. And not just who are these people, but what do they care most about? What is it that is on their mind day to day? And that is going to determine everything about your podcast, including the focus. What is your podcast actually going to be about? And a hint there, it's not going to be about you and your business. Really not at all. It's going to be about your audience and the world of your audience, what they care about. And in a second, we'll look at an example of what that looks like. It's going to determine what you call the podcast. It's going to determine what you talk about in the podcast. It's going to determine the length of episodes. It's going to determine how often you publish. And of course, it's going to determine who you have on the podcast. But everything goes back to the audience. So here's an example of how that might play out. So let's say that your business is, you're in the signage business. And I'm actually basing this on a call I had not long ago with a guy who in fact runs a company that does signage and branding for facilities like sports stadiums. And so we were talking about, well, what could a podcast look like if they wanted to start one? You know, why would a signage business start a podcast? Well, for really their goals were the same goals that we looked at just before. So we determined, well, who is their audience? Who are they talking to? They're talking to facility managers. Those are the folks that that use their services. And so that's the audience for this podcast. And those are their sales prospects. So it stands to reason that the focus of the podcast is going to be all about the world of facility management. And notice here, the podcast is not about signage and branding necessarily. It's going to be about that in some general way, but really it's about the world of facility management, and within that, the way that branding and signage plays a role. So what do you call the podcast? Well, there's a million different possibilities, but our strategy is to take the most straightforward approach to call it something like the Facility Manager Show. Now, that's not certainly the most creative or coolest sounding name. In fact, you might think, well, that's the most vanilla name, you know, boring. Like, couldn't we do better than that? And sure, and there might be various variations on that you could come up with. But the strategy here is that put yourself in the shoes of the potential of the listener and the prospect. If they think that to themselves, they don't know your company, your specific company, and frankly, they don't care about your specific company, even if they had heard of you. What they care about is what they do in their world. So if it crosses their mind that, you know, I'm getting into podcasts, I wonder if there are any podcasts about what I do, what are they going to search for? They're going to search for the most obvious thing, facility management or facility managers. So you want your show to pop up when they do that. And so it's kind of like a basic SEO strategy. And what are you going to talk about on the podcast? What are the topics going to be? Well, simply the things that facility managers care about and deal with. Now, since you're in this line of work, hopefully, if you've had any success, you already have a pretty good sense of what those things are in the market research that you've done. But the nice thing about this model too is that it's really not up to you to come up with all the topics. You can let your guests do that. You reach out to the guest, and before you do any interviews, you have a chat with them, a dialogue about what do you care about? What would be some stuff that you want to talk about on the podcast that your fellow facility managers can learn about? So the guests do a lot of heavy lifting for you. And of course, the guests are, of course, the facility managers, the very people that you're already talking to, that you're marketing to already. So any questions about that right off the bat or comments? Okay. So the basic strategy here, and this really bears repeating, I mean, this is the core of the strategy. Invite onto your podcast as guests anyone you want to get to know that can help you grow your business. That could be a direct prospect, a referral partner, potential customers of any sort. It could be existing customers to learn more about them. But that is really the key here. Naming your show. We already talked about this a little bit. Best naming practices needs to be short, 30 characters or less, so that it shows up on a phone and that it doesn't get cut off. It needs to be simple and direct, and like in the example I showed before, needs to align with your audience expectations. So again, always put yourself in the place of your audience. And if you were searching for the thing that you care about, what words and phrases would you use? That gives you a pretty good guide for what you should call your show. Now, this is different, of course, if your goal, if you're starting a podcast and the goal is to generate the largest possible audience and then make money by selling ads on the podcast. That's really a very different model. That's really, you're creating a show that's meant to primarily entertain people. For these kind of niche podcasts for a business purpose, the audience matters, but you're not trying to get to the top of the Apple podcast charts. You're not trying to just to get as many people out in the world as possible to listen. You're trying to get a very specific kind of listener to tune in. And that's why making the name really directly attuned to that kind of listener is the way to go. Cover art is another part of this. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but here's just a random sampling of several different kinds of cover art. Again, you should let your audience dictate. The more you know about the kind of visual expression that's bound to resonate with your audience, that's gonna drive the cover art. I'm not a designer, and I really don't have an eye for this stuff, so I don't want to say too much. You can see at a glance, though, that there's a really wide variety. The only commonality really is they're all squares, and that's really your only limitation. They need to be a square.
I have a question.
Other than that, it's sort of up to you. Yes.
How important is it to work your business name into your cover art? Because you said like it's not necessarily, you don't have to name your podcast after your business, but do you want to make that connection like right off the bat with the art?
That's a really good question. And I would say yes or yes and no. Again, the strategy here is that the podcast is all about the world of your guests and audience. It's really not about you, except that it is. And what I mean by that is you're the platform, you're producing it. You'll be the host, right? Or someone from your company will be the host. Now, of course, you do want people to make some connection between the podcast and your business. So if you're going to do that, it would need to be not the main thing. It wouldn't be the first thing you see or the most prominent thing. It would be more like something like down here, brought to you by. That would be one way to do it. But mainly you want to make the title and the main image something that's all about the people you want to listen, because that's what people care about. They don't care who's producing this podcast, not really. But strategically, you do want them to at least be aware of that one way or the other. So that's a good question. Talk a little bit about the host of the podcast. The host is obviously a crucial part of it. The ideal host, there's a couple factors here. Ideally, the host is someone at your company. And even more ideally, it's the person at your company who is in either marketing or sales or both, or at least is responsible in some way with connecting with customers and potential customers. For a couple reasons, because people in those roles tend to have the kind of attributes that that map onto good attributes for a podcast host, namely someone who's good with people, someone who likes meeting new people, someone who's a good conversationalist, someone who's a good listener, someone who likes learning about other people and their stories. This is important in marketing, right? It's really important in sales, and it's important for hosting a podcast too. And here are some of those attributes that I mentioned. And, you know, I put down here sales skills because the whole strategy here is not to turn the podcast into a sales pitch. That's the last thing you want to do. You don't want to sell people at all on the actual podcast. But at the same time, this is all part of a sales strategy. And a lot of the actual selling kind of happens in the margins, as we'll get into in a minute. But it also plays into actually doing the interview with prospects, as we'll talk about a little bit more a little bit later on. This doesn't mean that the host has to be literally a salesperson. but it helps if they have some of the same skills that enable good salespeople to do what they do well. Another little part of this is using a production schedule to keep track of episodes. It's really a simple spreadsheet. And as you see here, the different kind of basic and just obvious columns, episode titles, when you're doing interviews, who the guests are, due dates for editing and so on, and then of course publishing dates. Once you get your podcast going, and we can talk a little bit about best practices around how frequently you might publish a podcast. I mean, I'll just say a quick word about that. It really, again, it depends on your audience and it depends on your strategy. If your strategy is to grow your business by having conversations with people you need to get to know, well, then the more of those conversations you're having, the more of them are going to turn into the kinds of relationships that are going to help your business grow, namely turning prospects into clients. It's in a way just a matter of volume. So the more of those conversations you have, the better, meaning the more podcast episodes you publish, the better. Of course, that's also determined by how much time you have and what your budget is and so on. But so some people publish a monthly podcast because that's what makes sense for them. You could publish twice a month. You could publish weekly. I publish a podcast for my business. I use the same exact strategy, by the way. I started publishing it weekly, upped it to 3 times a week, and now I publish it every day, believe it or not. At first, that seemed insane. How could I possibly manage that? Then I realized I have that many people I want to be talking to. That's how I get all my business. So I found a way to publish it daily, and I use a schedule that looks pretty much exactly like this. And that's really all I need. It's just a matter of organizing things. Okay, and then of course you have to actually produce content. So we've kind of gone through the planning phase now. Those are some of the basic things you have to keep in mind just to figure out, should we even do a podcast at all? If we're going to do it, why are we doing it? How to figure out what the podcast is going to be about and what the episodes are going to be about and so on. So we've covered all that. And then you get to the stage you're saying, okay, all those things are in place. It's time to actually start producing some content. And this really happens in 3 phases. And this is mapped onto how you develop a relationship with the guests that you bring on. There's before the interview, the actual interview itself, and then once you've done the interview. And we're going to look at each of those stages. So the pre-interview. Now, this is assuming that you've built out that production schedule and you have in place what the topic for, let's say, episode 1, and who the guest is going to be. And you have a sense already as the host, as the planner of the podcast, what you're going to talk about, like why you're choosing this guest and how you're going to talk about this topic, because topics when starting out tend to be kind of broad. There's all kinds of ways you could talk about a topic. And it's especially important, though, to think carefully about exactly what kind of story do you want to tell? What exactly do you want to talk about? Because you want the episode to be a specific length. One thing to avoid is to say, well, let's just do an interview. It'll be as long as it is. Maybe it's an hour and we'll whittle it down to 20 minutes. We'll just choose the best parts. That tends not to work. You can do it, but it takes a lot of extra time and you end up kind of cobbling stuff together rather than with a piece of content that feels more organic. So you determine beforehand, how long are episodes going to be? And that's a question I get a lot. And starting out, it's a little difficult to know. I think a sweet spot is about 15 to 20 minutes because a lot of people listen to podcasts in the car while they're driving. And, the commute can be, some people have a 10-minute commute, some people it's an hour. But I think on average might tend to be about 15, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. And most people can consume a podcast episode of 15 or 20 minutes at a go, whether they're driving or walking or doing whatever else. But you can always ramp it up or down. You can, if it turns out that your audience only really wants very short podcasts and they want them to be no longer than 7 minutes, then you do 7 minutes. If If they want it longer and they want a full half hour, you do a half hour. The point is, whatever you've determined the length to be, that's how long you want the actual interview to be, roughly speaking. And in order to make that happen, you need to connect with the guest before you do the interview. Ideally, actually having a chat. It can be a Zoom chat, right? But actually connecting. If absolutely necessary, it can be done by email, but it's important actually to do it, to have a real conversation for a couple of reasons. One, you can then have a dialogue and really get the guest's input about, okay, here's the topic I have in mind, and here's why I chose you. What do you think? What are the top 3, maybe 4 talking points that we want to hit given our audience? What do you think is going to be most engaging? And that's why I mentioned before, the guest does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. You're reaching out because it's not just that they're someone you want to talk to help you grow their business. They're also a legitimate subject matter expert for this topic, right? So they're bringing a lot of expertise to the table.
I
And
have a question,
together,
Jeremy.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jeremy. I
No,
have
go
a
ahead.
quick question about that.
Yeah.
If you have a longer conversation, is it possible to have like a part 1 and a part 2 situation?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So you can, and that's a good question, because going back to the length of episodes for a second, sometimes the length is at least partly determined by the topic itself. There are some topics that naturally lend themselves to a longer episode. And in that case, you might let the audience know you have options there. You could say, we're going to do a short series, like a 2-part series, a 3-part series on this topic. That's one way to do it. You could let your audience know this is going to be an extra long episode. There's just that much to talk about, or maybe you have multiple guests on the episode. Whenever you have multiple guests, they tend to be longer because there's more people talking, and you can let your audience know this is a special 1-hour episode. It's just, that's what we need to really do justice and so on. So you have a lot of leeway there. But yes, that's a good question. So in any case, you really, the guest will bring a lot of expertise, knowledge here, and be able to help you hone the topic even better than you could on your own, just because they'll have knowledge that you don't have. And they'll be experts on the audience too. After all, they are your ideal listener, right? They're a member of the group, of the audience that you're talking to. And so they'll have insight into, like, yeah, here's what my kind of people, my tribe, so to speak, here are the things we really care about. So they'll help you hone it. During this conversation, this is where you're planting what I'm calling sales seeds. You're not selling. You're not doing a sales pitch, but in a strategic way, through this conversation, you're qualifying. You're getting a sense of how interested might this person be in what we do and what we have to offer. How you do that specifically determines on what your business is, but I'll give you an example. So again, I said I use this same exact strategy. So my podcast that I publish is called Engage Your Tribe. It's all about the art and science of audience engagement. And the people I invite on as guests are marketing leaders at companies of particular sizes. I usually go for companies of anywhere from about 50 employees to maybe 500 employees. So a pretty big range, but not big giant companies in any case. And I want to talk to the VP of marketing typically. So I invite folks on and I just send them a simple cold email, very simple and short. Hey, I produce such and such podcast with a link to it. I think you'd be a great guest. If you're interested, the first step is to schedule a quick call to discuss topics, which leads to this meeting. When I do that, the first thing people do, if they're even at all interested, is they click on the link, look at the podcast to make sure it's a real thing and not just a trick or like a bait and switch. And they'll see, oh, okay, yeah, this is a legit podcast. A lot of marketing leaders have been on here. They're talking about all kinds of topics that are relevant to me. Yeah, I could do this. And they'll also often click on the link to my business and see, oh, okay, this seems to be some kind of podcast production business. I guess that makes sense. They don't really care at the moment so much. They just are curious, but the seed is planted. So, people are not dumb. they might put two and two together and say, oh, okay, this is a person who produces podcasts. They're reaching out to me to be on their podcast. Maybe this is part of their marketing, but they legitimately want me to be on their podcast and it seems to be a real thing. So, okay, there's value there for me. Yeah, it would be cool to be featured on a podcast. And, maybe we're even interested in some podcast production or not, but okay, I'll have that meeting that to talk about topics. Let's see what happens. I think that's the attitude I get a lot. And in those meetings, I spend, I'd say 90% of it asking them, so tell me about your business. Tell me about your marketing strategies and your digital marketing strategy. And we are looking for a focus for the podcast, something to talk about. And so we'll spend most of the time, this is usually a half-hour meeting, most of the time talking about that. And then I'll say, well, let's tell me about your digital marketing. I'm looking at your website here and you have some webinars. I see you have a blog, you do some video stuff, and they'll talk a little bit about that. And then now part of the companies I'm reaching out to, I know they don't have a podcast already because I've looked. Now, sometimes I'm wrong and they actually do have one and I missed it. If they do, then I'll say, oh, I see you have a podcast. That's awesome. Tell me about that. And then that's what we'll talk about in the interview. Because even though they turn out maybe not to be a good candidate for me, they already have a podcast, that's good content for me. I'm getting someone on my podcast and I'm recording video too, kind of doing a good testimonial, not about my company, just about podcasting and why it's awesome and how it helps them grow their business. But ideally, they don't have a podcast. And so I'm going through and so I say, hey, why don't you have a podcast? I don't see a podcast here. What happened to your podcast? And I just kind of throw it out there. And I'm not saying, well, do you want to have a podcast or should we talk about doing it? I just say, where's your podcast? And depending on the answer, that gives me a lot of information. So they might say, oh, well, yeah, we thought about that, but decided not to do it. Oh, okay, really? Why not? What kept you from doing it? And I just keep them talking about it. And sometimes that can lead to me saying, well, actually, have you thought about doing it this way? Oh, no, actually, yeah, that's interesting. Or they might say, yeah, we did, and we're just not doing it. Okay, good. Good signal to me that this probably isn't going to turn into a client, at least not right away. We're still going to do the interview because who knows down the line, maybe they change their mind, but at least I know. But often I get people who say, I'll say, where's your podcast? And they might laugh and say, oh, yeah, we've been trying to do that for a long time. It's on our list of planning and we're just not sure how to get started. Aha. I say, oh, really? Well, actually I do a presentation just like the one I'm doing right now. I do a presentation about how to start up a podcast. It takes about a half hour. Is that something you might be interested in? Yeah, actually, that would be great. Can we set that up? Yes, we can. And so in a very kind of nonchalant way, I've now set up another meeting to talk about setting up a podcast. And, notice I don't say, well, I run a podcast production business. We could do this for you. I just say, oh, I do a presentation on how to start it up. Totally free. And I get a lot of people who sign up for that because again, they're like, okay, yeah, we're kind of interested in that. It would be good to learn how it works. And so I'm just planting that seed there. Sometimes we set it up right there. More often I say, okay, cool. Well, let's schedule our interview right now. Let's get that on the books. And then once we do that, we can talk about setting up the next meeting to talk about podcasting. Okay. Okay, great. That's how that works. And from your own perspective, whatever your business is, you can make that work too by doing essentially the same thing. Just instead of saying, why don't you have a podcast? It's what about X or I'm looking at your website. Tell me about this thing that relates to your business. There are all kinds of different ways of doing this, but that approach is what I have really found to work. Now, once you've done this, and then you use this information, not just to get that next sales call, but actually to prepare for the interview. So it helps you write questions and develop a flow script, which is essentially just how the interview is going to go. A short introduction. Hey, welcome to the podcast, everyone. My guest is so-and-so. They're here to talk about this topic. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for having me. And then you get into the questions. And we're not going to talk a ton right here about exactly how to write questions, although there is much to discuss, but that's part of it. Quick word about interviewing, about recording. There are really two ways to do it. You can do it in studio, and you can, it's not, I'm not going to talk a lot about right now because we don't have time about how to build an in-house podcast studio. I can just say it doesn't have to cost a lot of money and it doesn't have to be that complicated. Essentially, this is a podcast studio right here, a computer, a couple of microphones. This little thing is called an audio interface, oops, where the mics plug into, and that's it. And then you can bring people into your studio and record. Also, remote recording. 99% of the recording I do is remote. This allows you to interview people anywhere in the world. And all you need is a microphone. This is a popular USB microphone, meaning it plugs right into your computer. And there are any number of remote recording platforms. I like to use one called Riverside FM. I just prefer it, but there are many other ones. A lot of people use Zoom. It's okay. I don't think the quality is that great, really. But there are other options there. And anyone who's interested in another time, we could talk about the ins and outs of actually getting good audio and stuff like that. In any case, whether you're doing in person or remote, the actual interview is another crucial touch point with the guest / client or prospective client. And there are a couple moving parts here. One is before you start recording, when people now, there's this whole dynamic. I could go on and on about interviewing and really do a whole presentation just about that. I'm not going to do that now. But doing a good interview, there's an art and a science to it. It's more than just having a list of questions and asking them. There's a lot more to it than that. And that's, again, why the host of the podcast plays such a crucial role. Because, again, the purpose of doing this interview is to create the content, for sure. But it's also you're developing that relationship with your guest. Again, someone you want to get to know for strategic purposes. And so part of that is being friendly with them, making them feel comfortable. A lot of people, when it comes to the actual interview, can get a little nervous because it's kind of like they're on the spot and they don't want to look stupid or mess up. So part of it is just making them calm and telling them we're recording this, we'll edit it, you're going to be great. Also in this before you hit record, it's an opportunity to chat a little bit. And if there's more opportunities to kind of plant those seeds, that's a good moment for it. Once you're actually doing the interview, you have your questions. Listening is a really important skill. Again, we could talk a lot about that, but I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole. You want this to be a fun and engaging experience for the guest. You want it to be lively, not kind of informal. You want it to be a real conversation, not like an interrogation. And you want to have fun. It doesn't need to be super duper serious, even if the topic is a business topic usually. But there's you want the guest to come away from this thinking, wow, that was really cool. That was a great conversation. I was a little nervous at first, but the host made me feel comfortable, and I really got to talk about something I'm passionate about. And the host clearly had prepared and asked really good questions. And yeah, wow, I feel a real connection with this person. That's your goal. And then once you're done with the recording, that's when the guest is usually in the best possible mood. They've done a great job. They've had this invigorating conversation. Now, when you've planted those seeds before, especially if they said, yeah, I'm kind of interested in a demo or talking more about whatever it is, that's when to round back to that and say, okay, so thank you so much for the interview. I'm gonna produce it and publish it and share it and let you know. Now, by the way, would now be a good time to set up our next meeting to talk about the next thing? Okay, sure. Just get it on the calendar right there. Or they might say, well, yeah, I want to bring my team into that. So email me and then we'll go back and forth. But again, after the interview, even if it's just 5 minutes, that's another important moment when you can follow up or probe a little bit more to see where the guest might be interested. And then there's the post-interview follow-up. And this is just as important. So immediately the next day or so, sending a thank you to the guest, maybe even sending them a gift, some kind of gift for being on the podcast. A week later, say, emailing them about when the podcast is going to be published according to your publication schedule. Then, of course, emailing the guest when the episode actually goes live, because that's an exciting moment for the guest. Hey, your podcast is live now. All of your people, all of your colleagues and friends can hear it, and they'll be excited about that. They will want to share it. And of course, you want to promote every single episode on social media and tag the guest there. As soon as I promote each episode on LinkedIn, that's where my customers are. And I tag them, I record video, and I don't publish the entire video on YouTube, although sometimes I do. I publish clips of it, both on YouTube and on LinkedIn. And I publish multiple clips. And every time I do that, it's another touch with the person I interviewed, because they get pinged on LinkedIn. And if you're on LinkedIn and you know, when you get that, it's kind of a cool moment. Oh, cool. Someone mentioned me. What are they saying? Who is it? And that's the way that you build relationships, right? And also you enable your guest you want them to rate your podcast, give it 5 stars because they've had a great experience. You want them to rate it, and you want them to share it with all their friends. And so you encourage them to do that. Now, once you've recorded content, and now we're getting into a little bit of kind of the nuts and bolts of how you actually publish a podcast and get it out there so people can find it and listen to it. You publish content on what's called an audio hosting platform. Here you can see these are some of the most common. You might have heard of some of these: SoundCloud, Speaker. I use one called Buzzsprout. They all do essentially the same thing. This is where all of your content lives. The description of the show, the cover art, you only have to publish that one time. For every episode, you write a headline and then show notes, a description of what that episode is about. By the way, the show description and the show notes, those are often overlooked, but very important for SEO purposes. And so you want to be strategic there. What is your show about? This should be more than just one sentence. This should be maybe a paragraph or 2, getting into some detail about who is the show for, what kind of topics do you talk about, and so on. What kind of guests do you have on? And then the show notes, again, in every episode, what did you talk about? Because when people search nowadays, individual podcast episodes will show up. So this is an opportunity for you to get more content out there in the world about what you're talking about. Once you have audio, once you have that stuff on a hosting platform, that creates a feed that you then register with all these podcast directories. Apple Podcasts, this one is called Stitcher, Spotify, Google, and many, many others. The hosting platform often helps you automate this, but once you register the feed, that's a one-time process. Then it gets approved by Apple and Spotify and so on. And that's how people find it. So when they go to their phone and they open their podcast app, whichever one they use, then they can search for podcasts, just like some of you folks do, and you find it and you subscribe. And then every time you publish a new episode, it shows up in that feed. And that's how people discover your podcast. And then finally, there's the promotion element. So it's not enough just to have it out there. You have to let people know, of course. And there are all kinds of different ways to do this. One, you promote a podcast just like you would promote anything else that you're promoting, using all your existing channels, your social channels, your website, newsletter, email marketing, and so on. And you do this before the podcast launches, when the podcast launches, and then every time you put a new episode out there, you're promoting it every single time across all of your channels. Again, just like you would promote anything. You want to generate ratings and reviews for your podcast. The most efficient way to do this is get everyone at your company to do it. Just make them do it. Your network, your friends, and every guest. Make it easy for every single guest to give you a 5-star rating. They'll be highly motivated to do that. And a key to this is once you start publishing a podcast, whatever the cadence is, monthly, twice a month, whatever, stick to that schedule. The same, let's say you're doing it twice a month, the first and third Tuesday of every month, stick to that schedule. Don't miss it, because that's how people will listen. That's how people get into the rhythm. They'll know, okay, it's the third Tuesday. I'm looking forward to that next episode. Here it is. If you don't stick to that, people will eventually drop off because they'll say, I don't know when the next episode is coming. They're not publishing regularly. I guess the podcast isn't happening anymore. And then finally, the content strategy to really get the most value out of a podcast. You start with a simple interview and you turn that into all kinds of other content as regularly as you can. You can record video at the same time and chop it up. Turn every interview, you can easily transcribe interviews, turn them into blog posts, turn them into white papers, newsletter content, website content, and all kinds of social media content. It's a lot easier to start with a transcript and repurpose that than it is the blank screen and write a blog post or whatever from scratch. I'm sure all of you have experienced that. And that is pretty much it. Oh, then there's measuring success. So of course, how do you know if your podcast is actually working? There are a few ways to do this. You get good analytics on podcasts, and the hosting platform is where you get this. It depends on the platform you're using, but at the very least, you get both episode per episode and overall and over different time spans, how many people are listening to this podcast, overall subscribers and listeners per episode. This is very important, obviously, just to track this generally, but also to see, oh, we got a bump here, a spike. What was that episode about? Huh. Okay, that was about this topic. And then here's a similar topic here that also got a bump. Seems like our audience is really into those kind of topics. Helps you hone it down even more. But also, of course, as we talked about right up front, your goal isn't necessarily your only metric of success is not just how many people are listening, it's how many people that you have on as guests are turning into clients. Again, this is especially relevant if you're doing any kind of B2B business. But one way or the other, how is this podcast generating business for us? How many listeners are turning into clients, maybe? That can be a little harder to determine, but there are ways to do it. But at the end of the day, you're not doing this just for fun or just to have something that people are listening to. You want it to, one way or the other, help promote and grow your business. And so you have to have ways of tracking that. And that finally is it. I know I wanted to leave a little more time for questions. I guess we technically only have 4 minutes left. But there it is. In a nutshell, how to use podcasting to grow your business. We have a few minutes for questions, if anybody has questions.
Feel free to unmute and ask away. Jeremy, I have a quick thought here.
Yes.
So how long do you think it would take when you start? You're going to have very few listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And does that ramp up pretty quickly if you're following all the other strategies?
Yes, I have found that it does. It's the good thing about doing a business podcast is that you already have a built-in audience. You have an audience of the people you work with, for one, and your existing customers and clientele. So I have found typically that when our customers start a new podcast, if they follow all those steps and they do a good job of promoting it, especially even before it launched, it's not unusual for even the very first episode to get a couple hundred listens because you've built up this thing. It's, hey, we're launching a brand new podcast. Usually what happens is the first few episodes get kind of a bump, and then you'll see kind of a plateau because the initial excitement wears off a little bit. And then you have to really be on top of promoting it and promoting every episode. But it doesn't have to take, so it's not, I found typically it's not that you start with like 0 or just like your mom is listening or something. You actually do start with a decent sized audience. And then again, it depends on your goals. But if you're promoting it really regularly and really tapping into where your potential listeners are, then you see it rise over time. But it is a longer term play. I'd say to really know if a podcast is working, you want to stick with it for at least 6 months and ideally even a year to really get a sense of, is this working or not? It takes time. You're not going to know after 3 episodes. It's a good question.
Jeremy, I have a question. Are there
Yes.
2 or 3 business podcasts that you think are really best practices? Things that you would tell us to seek out to get some ideas?
So do you mean businesses that are producing podcasts that I would recommend, like check
Yes.
theirs out? They're really doing it well.
Yes, or business themed podcasts, maybe small business.
You know what? That's a good question. And I honestly don't have like 1 or 2 that I'd say, yes, these are obviously the best. There are many good ones out there, and there are many bad ones. And I think the difference is I listen to many, sort of randomly find many businesses that are doing podcasts. And the biggest mistake I see is that the audio quality is really bad. They just don't spend enough time on making it sound professional. I think the assumption is sometimes, well, this is just our business. Like it's just so niche. Like people are tuning in just for the information. It doesn't matter if it sounds good. That's absolutely wrong. If it doesn't sound good, it's just not a good listening experience and people will find something else to listen to. I didn't talk a lot about that, but getting good quality audio is very important.
Jeremy, another question. I know they have the Flyover podcast festival in, I think it's in the spring or summer in Bloomington.
Yeah.
Have you participated in that? And what would you say about that program?
Yeah, I have. In fact, I helped plan the very first one, which was like 3 or 4 years ago now. I have participated, it's here in Bloomington at the Mill, which is a great space. And I would highly recommend it if you're interested in podcasting. It's every year is a little different, but it's a good way to meet people who are doing podcasting, to go to different sessions, and to meet other people who are interested in podcasting. So yeah, I would highly recommend it.
What
It's
time of
definitely-
year?
It's been done typically in the fall,
Okay.
September or October. So it'd be next year. But there are lots of podcast conferences out there. It's another good way to learn about podcasts.
Yeah.
So folks, I have to go because I have another appointment, but I just want to thank you all so much for spending your morning on this. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about this and present. So thank you to the Chamber for giving me the opportunity. Thank you all so much. And I would be more than happy to chat with any of you about podcasting, answer any questions, do one-on-one chats. The Chamber has my contact information. So please reach out for any reason. I won't sell you on anything. If you just want to chat and you're curious, always happy to do that. So thank you guys so much. And I hope that we'll reconnect at some point.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Sounds
Jeremy.
great. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank everybody for attending today. We'll get everybody off to the rest of their day. So enjoy it and have a great weekend. And if, like I say, if we can help you, if I can connect you to Jeremy or you have any other questions, feel free to give me a call here at the Chamber. Thanks, guys.
And what was his last name?